welcome to the deep dive.
Okay, let's jump right into something pretty huge happening in the Mac world. Apple's hardware platform, it's right in the middle of this, well, massive transition, moving entirely over to their own Apple Silicon chips. And as we looked ahead to the next version of macOS, the one rumored to be called macOS 26 Tahoe, there are some really significant changes coming, especially if you're one of the many people still running an Intel-based Mac.
That's exactly right. And it's why we're here. We've been digging into all the reports, the rumors, everything swirling around this next major macOS release. Our mission really is to pull out the key insights, the facts, to help you understand what this shift means right now and, what the future looks like, particularly when you're holding on to that Intel hardware. Right. So we're going to cover the expected timeline for macOS 26. We'll dive into which specific Intel Macs are rumored to be, well, on the chopping block. And crucially, we need to unpack why Apple is making these moves. We'll try and connect it directly to some of those demanding new features like Apple Intelligence. Yeah. And of course, for anyone affected, what are the implications? Like how long might you still get security updates? Think of this as your shortcut to getting properly informed on what feels like a really critical moment in Mac history.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Starting with the name, everyone probably expected, Mac OS 16, just following the sequence. But the strong rumors are pointing to a big jump straight to Mac OS 26.
Like 26?
Yeah.
That feels like a huge leap from 15. Why? What's the thinking there?
Well, the chatter suggests it's about alignment. Apple might be trying to align its major OS version numbers more closely with the calendar year. It looks like a move towards what some are calling year-adjacent numerical titles. Think iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all potentially hitting version 26 around the same time. It makes sense, for clear, unified branding.
Okay, got it. So sort of a marketing and consistency thing. Makes sense. But they're keeping the fun code names, right? The California landmarks.
Oh, absolutely. That tradition seems safe. Tahoe has been widely rumored as the code name for macOS 26.
macOS 26 Tahoe. Huh. It kind of combines the new number with that familiar place name. Maybe that's a way to ease people into the new numbering, a transitional thing.
That seems like a pretty solid guess, yeah. It keeps something recognizable while making that big numerical shift.
Okay, so name and version number sorted. When do we actually get to see this thing? What's the timeline looking like?
Right, the big reveal. That's always the most anticipated part. It's expected, as usual, at Apple's Worldwide Developers Conference, WWDC 2025. And if we look at Apple's typical patterns, the keynote reveal will almost certainly land on Monday, June 9th, 2025.
Mark your calendars. And the developer beta usually drops right after the keynote, doesn't it?
Exactly, same day. Then the public beta tends to follow a bit later, probably sometime in July 2025. And the final public release. That's typically projected for the fall. Think September or October, usually lining up with new iPhones and the other OS releases. It's a very predictable rhythm they've got.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. And, well, maybe a little concerning for some users. A really central theme across all reports is that macOS 26 is going to continue dropping support for more older Intel Macs, specifically ones that are currently running macOS Sequoia just fine. This really feels like a critical point, an acceleration in the transition, because we're talking about machines that probably still feel pretty recent to the people who own them.
That's the key point, exactly. And there's one specific rumor that's caught a lot of attention because it involves a relatively new model. The 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro, specifically the one with two Thunderbolt 3 ports, is strongly rumored to be cut off. No macOS 26 support for that one.
A 2020 model? Wow. I mean, that feels incredibly fast. The machine's only 4 years old right now. Why that specific MacBook Pro? What's the reason?
So, the reason cited in the material we've reviewed, it comes down to the processor. That particular two-port version used an older 8th generation Intel Core processor. And that's the crucial difference compared to the 4-port 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro, which had a newer 10th generation Intel chip. That CPU generation gap seems to be the primary technical driver behind this rumored cut.
Okay, so it's really about the engine inside, not just the year it was sold. I did see one report mention that the original leaker who flagged that specific 2020 MacBook Pro rumor, apparently they expressed some personal surprise, maybe skepticism about it.
That's correct. There was some mention of that. But the technical reasoning that reliance on the 8th gen chip is what makes it seem plausible to a lot of tech journalists and analysts looking at it. It just fits the pattern, Apple gradually raising the minimum hardware specs and phasing out older processor architectures.
Okay. So besides that specific, slightly surprising 2020 model, what other Intel Macs are consistently popping up on these rumored end-of-the-road lists for macOS 26?
Based on the sources we've seen, you're looking at all the 2018 MacBook Pro models, also the Intel-based 2020 MacBook Airs. Then there's the 2017 iMac Pro, which was always a bit of a unique case, in the 2018 Mac Mini models. There's also some suggestion, maybe a bit less certain, that certain 2019 iMac models might be dropped too. That adds a layer of complexity, doesn't it? Because other 2019 or even early 2020 models might still be supported.
Yeah, that granularity is really telling. It suggests these aren't just like arbitrary cuts based purely on age. It's about specific technical capabilities. What's fascinating here is, well, it implies that the Intel Macs that do make the cut for macOS 26, machines like the 2019 Mac Pro or maybe those higher-end 2020 iMacs, they probably remain supported because of very precise internal specs.
Exactly. It's clearly not just about having the T2 chip anymore, even though many of these later models had it. Future compatibility seems to hinge on things like specific GPU models, maybe the capabilities of other co-processors, or even the system's thermal design. How well it can handle the sustained load of newer OS features. Remember, macOS Sonoma already ditched Macs with 7th gen Intel CPUs. So if macOS 26 needs an even higher baseline, maybe effectively requiring 10th gen Intel or obviously Apple Silicon for certain features, or just for smooth performance, well, that gives a pretty clear technical justification for dropping those 8th gen systems like that 2-port 2020 MacBook Pro.
Right. The minimum requirement just keeps ticking upwards for Intel.
So who is expected to be compatible with macOS 26 then? What's the list look like? Overwhelmingly, it's going to be Apple Silicon models. Pretty much every Mac with an M1 chip or later. So that's your MacBook Air, MacBook Pro, Mac Mini, iMac, Mac Studio, Mac Pro lines. Anything running on M-series silicon. But the report suggests a small group of Intel machines will hang on for this round. Some of those 2019 and 2020 vintage MacBook Pros and iMacs, and definitely the 2019 Mac Pro.
Yeah, I saw some of those comparative tables from the sources showing the models supported by Ventura, then Sonoma, and now projected for 26. It really drives home how fast that Intel list is shrinking. It's kind of a stark visual.
It paints a very, very clear picture of where Apple's focus and engineering efforts are going, no question.
Okay, so let's dig into the why behind all this.
Yeah.
Why is Apple making these cuts? I mean, it feels pretty aggressive, especially for models that are only a few years old. What's driving it?
It's really a mix, I think. A combination of strategic goals and just the sheer technical demands of the new software. The number one driver has to be accelerating the transition to Apple Silicon. It lets Apple fully leverage that vertical integration, designing the hardware and software together. That means better performance, better power efficiency, and unique features they can tie specifically to their M-series chips. Every Intel Mac that gets dropped basically helps consolidate the user base onto the single unified platform they control.
And it ties right back to what you said about processor generations, right?
Yeah.
The older Intel chips just don't have the same capabilities as Apple Silicon.
Exactly. They lack the raw performance in many cases, but also specific instruction sets, especially important for things like advanced AI processing. And they just don't have the overall architectural efficiencies that Apple Silicon was designed for. macOS 26, with all its expected new features, is raising that minimum hardware bar. To make sure you get a consistent, smooth experience across all supported machines, they need a higher performance floor. And that floor is increasingly being defined by Apple Silicon capabilities.
And the sources we looked at specifically call out Apple Intelligence as a major feature demanding this newer hardware.
Oh, absolutely. Apple Intelligence looks set to be a cornerstone of the new OS experience, and it relies heavily on the neural engine, the NPU. Apple's actually been very explicit about this requirement already. They've stated, Apple Intelligence is available on all Mac models with M1 and later. That's pretty much a hard line. If you want those core AI features, you need an M-series chip.
So the headline AI stuff requires an M-series Mac. Got it. What about the design changes, that rumored digital glass look inspired by Vision OS? Does that play a role?
That's definitely another piece of the puzzle. That kind of visually rich interface, lots of translucency, complex but smooth animations. It requires significant GPU performance and also higher memory bandwidth. These are just inherent strengths of Apple Silicon's unified memory architecture. We're already seeing features exclusive to Apple Silicon, and this kind of design shift suggests that differentiation is only going to get deeper.
What about the T2 chip? We saw that pop up in those later Intel Macs. Is that still relevant here?
It is, though, maybe less directly than the main CPU or GPU now. The T2 security chip in those later Intel Macs, that was a step towards integrating security features like the Secure Enclave onto a separate chip. But Apple Silicon takes that concept much, much further. It integrates security, the MPU, media, engines, all sorts of things, directly onto the main system on a chip, the SU. That tighter integration potentially enables faster, more advanced security features and just overall system capabilities that could become fundamental requirements of the OS down the line, maybe leaving even T2-equipped Intel machines behind eventually.
And I guess, just practically speaking, supporting a smaller number of very similar Apple Silicon configurations must be way easier than managing a wide range of diverse Intel models from different years with different components.
Well, absolutely. That's a huge practical consideration.
Yeah.
Supporting that shrinking but still diverse range of older Intel hardware, it's a significant drain on engineering resources. Development, testing, QA, it all gets more complex. Reducing the number of supported models simplifies everything dramatically. It frees Apple up to really focus their efforts on optimizing macOS specifically for Apple Silicon. So the core takeaway here really is dropping Intel Macs isn't just about what they can't do with today's software. It's about unshackling Apple to design future features that basically assume Apple Silicon is present and can leverage its full capabilities. It allows for more ambitious innovation down the road.
Okay, so let's get practical. If you're listening right now on an Intel Mac that might be on this potential chopping block, what does this actually mean for you day to day?
Right. The most immediate, obvious impact is you won't be able to upgrade to macOS 26 or any future major macOS versions after that. Your machine will essentially be frozen on the last version it supported, which in this scenario would likely be macOS Sequoia. And that means missing out on all those anticipated new features we've been discussing. The Vision OS-inspired design, the Apple Intelligence stuff, updates to core apps, whatever else comes in macOS 26 and beyond.
So no shiny new features, but does that mean your Mac suddenly becomes insecure the day macOS 36 launches?
No, and that's a really critical point. Apple handles this pretty consistently. The end of feature updates does not mean an immediate end to security updates. Apple has a well-established practice here. They generally provide security patches for the two macOS versions prior to the current one.
So if macOS 26 is current, they'd still be patching 25, which is Sequoia, and maybe 24, which is Ventura. Is that the idea?
Yeah. That's the pattern we've seen hold true for years. So this suggests a Mac whose final supported OS is Sequoia should continue to receive security patches for roughly 2 to 3 years after macOS 26 comes out. We can look at historical examples from the sources we reviewed. macOS Big Sur, released late 2020, got its final security update in September 2023. That's nearly 3 years of security patches after its replacement, Monterey, arrived. Monterey itself, released late 2021, is expected to get updates until around September 2024. So, following that pattern, if Sequoia is the end of the line for your Mac, you can likely anticipate security patches continuing until maybe the fall of 2027.
Okay, so that gives you a pretty predictable window then. A few
Yeah.
more years of essential security coverage, even without new features. What else should someone with an affected Mac be thinking about?
Well, beyond the OS itself, there's the sort of slow creep of third-party software incompatibility. Over time, developers, well, they inevitably stop supporting older macOS versions. That means you might start missing out on new features in your favorite apps, maybe bug fixes, and potentially even important security updates from those app developers themselves. And older web browsers can also start to struggle with modern web standards and security protocols eventually.
Right, and I imagine the resale value probably takes a pretty significant hit when news like this comes out.
Oh, definitely. As soon as a model gets flagged as losing support for the next major OS, its resale value tends to decline, often quite sharply. News like this often acts as a catalyst, prompting people to start seriously considering an upgrade to Apple Silicon anyway.
What about trying to run the new OS unofficially?
Yeah.
You sometimes hear about tools like Open Core Legacy Patcher. Is that a viable option?
Yeah, those unofficial patching tools do exist, and there's a dedicated community around them. OpenCore Legacy Patcher is the main one, however. They are highly technical to set up and maintain. They carry significant risks, instability, things breaking unexpectedly, potential security implications. It's generally not a reliable or recommended path for most users, especially if you depend on your Mac for daily work or important tasks. Apple's move here effectively creates different tiers of Mac users, doesn't it? And it indirectly encourages upgrading by focusing future innovation and ensuring broad software compatibility primarily on the newer hardware platform.
So, shifting gears slightly, what's the buzz been like around these rumors, particularly that one about the two-port 2020 MacBook Pro? What are analysts in the wider tech community saying?
That specific rudder about the two-port 2020 model being dropped, Yeah, that definitely stirred up a lot of discussion. And even though the original source reportedly expressed some personal, let's say, hesitation or surprise about it, analysts like Michael Burkhardt have commented publicly. They've said the technical reasoning behind it, specifically that 8th gen Intel chip, makes it entirely plausible. It just aligns with how Apple's been managing this whole transition. That kind of validation from experienced industry watchers definitely lends credibility to the report.
And where does this kind of pre-release info usually come from? Is it reliable?
Well, a lot of this stuff originates from reputable private sources, often sharing details on platforms like X, which the tech community follows very closely. The detail about the 2020 13-inch two-port model is interesting precisely because of that combination you mentioned. A specific machine called out, a clear technical explanation provided, the older CPU, and then you have analysts finding that technical explanation quite believable.
What about the broader community feeling? What are users saying about the Intel transition pace and future support expectations?
You get a range of views, as you'd expect. Some people are actually quite keen for macOS to become Apple Silicon exclusive sooner rather than later. They believe it'll let Apple truly optimize the OS for its own hardware and maybe unlock even greater performance. There's also a general expectation, or maybe hope, that these Apple Silicon Macs will receive a much longer lifespan of OS support compared to their Intel predecessors. Maybe 7 to 9 years, perhaps even longer, given Apple's control over the whole stack now.
Is anyone pushing back on that optimism? Any counter arguments floating around?
Yeah, there's some speculation out there, though it's often met with a fair bit of skepticism, that Apple might eventually shorten the support runway, even for early M-series Macs like the original M1, to encourage upgrades to newer, more powerful chips down the line. But honestly, the M1 is still so incredibly capable that many people find that scenario pretty unlikely, at least for the near future. It highlights that natural tension, doesn't it? Users want their expensive hardware to be supported for a very long time, but they also want rapid technological advancement, which often means leaving older systems behind.
Yeah, and what's fascinating there, you touched on it, the M1's remarkable performance has, perhaps ironically, made some users less eager to upgrade. Their old M1 machine still feels incredibly fast for most tasks. That might actually influence how Apple approaches differentiating newer M-series chips and how they encourage upgrades without alienating that huge and generally happy M1 user base.
That's a great point. It's a really complex balancing act for Apple, figuring that out.
Okay, let's circle back briefly to some of those rumored macOS 26 features themselves,
Sure.
because looking at what's expected really helps underscore why certain hardware might not make the cut this time.
Absolutely. As we touched on, a major design overhaul seems likely, borrowing heavily from the Vision OS aesthetic. Think digital glass, more translucency, more sophisticated rounded elements, smoother animations. That kind of rich visual experience inherently demands significant graphical horsepower and efficient memory handling, which plays right into Apple Silicon's strength.
And Apple Intelligence is clearly top of the list in terms of demanding specific hardware, right?
Without a doubt, that whole suite of Apple Intelligence features smarter Siri, AI integrated into shortcuts, deeper personal context awareness, maybe even integration with models like Google Gemini. These are computationally heavy tasks. And as Apple themselves stated up front, these features rely heavily on the neural engine for efficient on-device processing. That M1 or later requirement seems pretty fundamental for getting the full experience.
What about other rumored app updates or system features?
Yeah, reports mention several things, maybe a new dedicated games app, adding Markdown export to notes, which would be nice, polls and translation features coming to messages, and possibly a significant redesign for the calendar app. On the system level, maybe things like seamless captive Wi-Fi, syncing across your devices, updates to Stage Manager, perhaps Stage Manager 2.0, and enhanced accessibility features.
Accessibility features like what?
Things like using iPhone continuity to bring magnifier functionality to the Mac, new vehicle motion cues to reduce motion sickness, improved Braille access, and maybe an accessibility reader. Some of these, especially those processing real-time data or integrating tightly with other devices, again, benefit substantially from the integrated processors and the power efficiency of Apple Silicon.
So the overall picture that emerges from looking at this potential feature list seems pretty clear, doesn't it?
It really does. When you look at this collection of features, it strongly suggests an operating system that is being increasingly designed by Apple Silicon for Apple Silicon. While sure, maybe some individual features could technically run on a high-end Intel Mac, the optimal performance, the best experience, and probably the full suite of new capabilities, they're likely being built specifically around the M-series architecture. Each new feature potentially adds more computational load or requires those dedicated accelerators like the NPU that older Intel Macs either lack completely or have in a much less capable form. It's this cumulative demand that provides a powerful technical justification for narrowing that list of supported hardware each year.
Okay, so pulling all this together, what's the big takeaway? What should people remember from this deep dive into the macOS 26 rumors and the Intel transition?
I think the main point is that macOS 26 Tahoe looks set to be another significant step, maybe even an accelerating step in Apple's transition away from Intel entirely. The specific rumors, like dropping the two-port 2020 13-inch MacBook Pro because of its older 8th-gen chip, really highlight that these compatibility decisions seem fundamentally driven by the demanding hardware requirements of new OS features, especially the push into AI and more sophisticated UI rendering.
Apple Silicon is just undeniably the future of the Mac platform. There's no ambiguity there.
Absolutely none. The phasing out of Intel support isn't just happening passively. It feels like a deliberate, accelerating strategy. It's about building a more powerful, more efficient, more secure, and tightly integrated ecosystem where Apple controls everything, from the silicon up.
And for owners of those Intel Macs that look like they might be left behind by macOS 26, what's the bottom line for them?
Well, the bottom line is your machine will certainly keep working on its last supported OS, likely Sequoia. And importantly, you should continue to get security updates for a defined period based on Apple's consistent pattern, probably 2 to 3 years after macOS 26 is released, so maybe until fall 2027. But access to brand new OS features and the cutting edge of software development is effectively ending for those machines. For the latest macOS experience and guaranteed long-term software compatibility, planning for an eventual upgrade to an Apple Silicon Mac seems like the prudent path forward.
Yeah, the future of macOS innovation, it's clearly being designed around the unique capabilities of Apple Silicon, the NPU, the unified memory, the deep integration.
Precisely. Those are the foundational building blocks for whatever Apple dreams up next for the Mac. To get the full evolving Mac experience, you'll increasingly need to be on that platform.
And thinking about it, this whole transition isn't just a technical migration. It's a really smart piece of product lifecycle management by Apple, isn't it?
It truly is. They're carefully balancing providing that necessary security window for older machines, which maintains user trust, while simultaneously creating a strong software-driven incentive for users to upgrade to their latest hardware over time. It keeps their hardware business healthy while moving everyone onto the platform where they can innovate the fastest.
It definitely makes you wonder what the very next step looks like after macOS 26.
Exactly. And given this apparent acceleration, there's already growing speculation. Could macOS 27, the one expected in 2026, potentially be the first version of macOS available exclusively for Apple Silicon Macs?
What would that final milestone look like? That's definitely a provocative thought for you to consider as the Mac platform continues this major evolution. Thanks for diving deep with us on this today.